Well, the book's called Heaven on Earth: A Journey Through Sharia Law, and as that suggests, it's not a textbook. It's not a kind of restatement of Sharia law, because I wouldn't be qualified to do that. The book's it's a series of questions, really. I began not knowing about Sharia law. I was living in New York at the time of the 9/11 bombings. I was living in London at the time of the 7/7 bombings there. And I became very, very interested in the fact that everyone was talking about Islam at the time. Everyone was talking about Islamic law. I'm a lawyer by background, and so I wanted to find out what Islamic law had to say about these things, because I'm also born a Muslim, and I consider myself to be a Muslim. But I've always been taught that Islam doesn't justify actions like this, but there were people who were claiming that it did. So I began then to think about this book. I decided that I'd go out and travel around, find out how Islam is practiced and understood, Islamic law is practiced and understood around the world. So I spent 1.5 years in libraries, and then I spent about half a year traveling around the Muslim world, beginning in my father's birthplace, which is in northern India. Then I went to Pakistan, to Iran, to Turkey, to Syria, to Lebanon, and ended up in Egypt, and speaking to many people along the way, just asking them how they understood what they understood Islamic law to be. And I was very surprised, because, as I say, I didn't know the answers to the questions, obviously, when I began my journey. But it turned out that Islamic law is incredibly diverse. There are people who say that Islamic law can be reduced to, for example, beheadings and stonings and misogynistic attitudes towards women. And those people are sometimes Muslim hardliners, but there are also people who are opposed to Muslims, who say that Islam is all about these things. What I found from my historical researches and from my traveling around was that it's been understood in many, many, many different ways over the last 1400 years. Some of them have been brutal, some of them have been misogynistic, but Islam is a great civilization. It spanned 3 continents. It lasted 1400 years precisely because Islamic law was such a dynamic, flexible system which was able to accommodate itself to different times and different societies. Sure, absolutely. The word Sharia means in Arabic path. More precisely, in the 7th century, it meant a path towards water, which was obviously a very important route for a desert people. And as that suggests, it's not a written system of codes at all. I mean, what it is, it's an idea of justice. It's an idea of the right thing to do. It's the path that you will follow if you want to attain salvation. In my book, I say that the closest English equivalent is the straight and narrow. There are, of course, many rules which have been written down to understand how one should follow that path, but as all Muslims recognize, almost all Muslims recognize, those rules are of very human origin. There's another word for them in Arabic, not Sharia, but fiqh, which means understanding, and it's human understandings of God's purpose. And those arguments, those interpretations have always been open to argument among Muslims. There's never been any dispute about the fact that they are to be argued about, that they're of human origin. Traditionally, Islamic law is made up of various sources. The written sources are the Quran, of course, which is regarded by Muslims as the holy word of God, but also hadiths. Hadiths are reports of what the Prophet Muhammad is said to have said and done during his lifetime. But those hadiths were written down over a period of 250 years, far, far away from Mecca and Medina, where the Prophet lived himself. And many of those hadiths are inauthentic. Everyone knows this. All Muslims themselves recognize this. And so the question is, which of those are to be regarded as binding, and to what extent does the passage of time affect the nature of the obligations themselves? Well, precisely because Islamic law is such a rich tradition, because there are thousands and thousands of hadiths, because there are thousands of Quranic verses, it's possible to draw interpretations to justify effectively any position, to be perfectly honest. One can look at the Quran and one can take out particular verses and say that these verses, for example, justify the a differential treatment of the evidence of a woman in court against that of a man, because there is one verse in the Quran which says that in a business transaction, a woman's you require the evidence from 2 women, where you'd only require the evidence of 1 man. But there's a specific context in which that arose. It specifically refers, it's the 7th century context, obviously. It refers specifically to business, and if one looks at what was happening in the 7th century, the very fact that women were capable of carrying out business transactions and of testifying in court was a huge advance from what had come before. I'm a lawyer in London, and I'm also a legal historian. I know what was going on in Europe at that time. The witness testimony barely existed, let alone witness testimony from women. Women weren't business people, they were chattels. So in the 7th century, it represented a huge advance. Now, obviously, if in the 21st century that's regarded as a ceiling of rights, it doesn't represent an advance at all. It's a very retrogressive interpretation of Islam. But I think it's very, very important to interpret a religious tradition, any religious tradition, but specifically the one into which I've been born, Islam, in a progressive manner, looking at the objectives of the Sharia. In Arabic, that's the word is maqasid. Because one can't be bound by the interpretations of the 7th century. One has to look deeper and understand how those interpretations now apply to the very different circumstances of the 21st century. Well, primarily it's me going out and me learning. I don't begin with any assumptions about the Sharia at all. I begin with a lot of questions. I go out, I speak to people about about their understanding of the Sharia, but obviously I am coming at it as a human being. I'm coming at it as an adult human being with views of my own, and it would be false of me to claim that I didn't have those, just as it's false of other people to claim that they aren't coming at these issues with views of their own as well. My views are that it cannot be right, for example, to justify an institution like slavery, to take a very easy example. There are passages in the Quran which could be understood to justify that, but of course there are far more passages which talk about the value of emancipation, the value of manumission of slaves. My view as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, is of course that those verses justifying emancipation take priority over those justifying slavery. In taking that view, I don't think that I'm setting myself above God or that I'm being arrogant in any way. I think I'm just being an honest human being, saying that, look, I come at this with personal views of my own, and I am trying to see whether or not those views can square with the Quran and with the Hadiths and with Islamic tradition as it's understood in the world today, and I believe that they can be. I was struck when I began the book by the level of ignorance that existed, not just among non-Muslims but also among Muslims themselves, and I of course was one of the most ignorant. I've already said that. I began knowing very, very little about the Sharia, about the Islamic tradition at all, and I went out and tried to find some answers. Now obviously not everyone has the luxury of doing that, not at all, and I was very privileged to have the opportunities and the chance to do that. But I do think it's important that that people approach this subject, people on all sides, whether they're Muslim or whether they're non-Muslim, approach this subject with an open mind and are prepared to ask questions, even if those questions feel uncomfortable.